Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with so many friends and personal and intellectual colleagues, especially to talk about the topic that was one of the two areas in which Steven began and in which I began my research. Industry shakeouts. And industry shakeouts is deserving of much more study than it has been. On the surface, if you don't know anything about it, it looks like it could turn out to be just some boring glitch, something that happened at a point in time, but it turns out not to be. And that if you understand industry shakeouts, you learn a lot about the evolution of industries and about the innovative process that drives sort of half of our technological growth in the economy. That is, the sort of incremental product and process improvement that plays out over time in industries, not so much the part of creating new products. And so it turns out that this phenomenon is tied up with industry evolution in a way that is at the core of what we should care about in industrial organization and caring about in studying how industries work. And because of its role in technology, it's also at the core of what drives economic growth, and yet it's been understudied. And so the shakeout of the sort that I had on the previous slide, where the number of firms having risen drops way off, is a key area for study. And in this talk, I'm trying to squeeze in so much at once, but I'm going to get across hopefully a couple themes. One is that there is a primary reason for industry shakeouts, I'm going to argue, and that despite the proliferation of theories and side issues that have come up, which some of them are very important, that the work that Steven did in helping to pioneer understanding of this is still totally relevant. And in this process, endogenous technological innovation is a crucial part of this. Second, if you study industry shakeouts, you do learn a lot about industry evolution, and the insights that one gets sometimes differs from views that have at times been predominant in thinking about industry life cycles. And there is broader study, of course, of industry life cycles, and I can't talk all about the industry evolution literature, but one review is by Peltonimi in 2011. So my remit here is that David asked me if I could reprise the work that I did with Steven on industry shakeouts and evaluate subsequent research on shakeouts. So I'll see what I can do in 20 minutes on the topic. Can't do everything. So let me start out by talking about how Klepper's model, Steven's model of industry evolution and shakeouts evolved over time. It really went through 4 key papers and stages of thinking. The first 3 of them informed by time series evidence on the number of firms, output, prices, and patents. So about every 6 years, he was coming up with a new version of the theory, and I believe that over time, his understanding advanced such that while there are still some deep insights you can get by going back to the earlier papers, we're getting to a better and better, in many ways, model of how industries work. The later 2002 Rand paper was informed further by the sorts of work that I started doing with him on panels of companies within industries, on the entry and exit of these companies, the innovation processes of these companies, and other information. And that's where the sort of micro-study, the histories of firms and industries really began, is through these studies that I started doing with him at Carnegie Mellon. And it really came after the 96 AER paper. And I don't have time to go through the model. I think most people kind of know how Steven has thought about this, but let me point out a few distinctive features here. A first set of features is to do with the characteristics and limits on the companies. There would be a limited number of companies driven by some sort of information diffusion process, presumably, that could enter an industry. These companies could grow at a limited pace. They can't expand to an enormous scale immediately. And this contrasts with textbook microeconomic models, which would pin down the number of companies in an industry based on cost curves. Instead, there's got to be something else that tells you how many companies will be in an industry at a point in time. And so that's what's doing it. In addition, he pushed the idea of heterogeneous fixed firm skill in yielding differences across firms. A second set of issues has to do with the role of research and development in the process. He always thought of this centrally to what's happening to these firms. And in the model, internal R&D inside the firms is driving quality of products and the nature of the products and the cost of manufacturing. That's central to this. And also central is that what matters competitively is recent R&D. The idea being that it's not just a learning curve sort of situation, because your knowledge that's competitively relevant ends up flowing out to other firms. So your competitors will, before too long, end up having a lot of the capabilities that you had earlier, and you have to keep racing the competition in order to stay competitively able. The third point here, and this was written in some beautiful work with Wes on testing the Schumpeterian hypothesis, is that R&D incentive rises with the current output of the firm. So bigger firms, by spreading the cost of R&D over more units, would be incentivized to push research whose cost relative to the value it gained is relatively minor. Do the polishing research that generates marginal improvements for the same dollar that small firms would not do. And thus, these firms would be far in the lead in terms of quality. Finally, the work really differs from what has been typical in industrial organization, in that the firms are treated as price takers. It's abstracting away from the predominant care of I.O. economists, which is, what are the games strategically that firms are playing with each other? And it's saying, no, this is driven by the environment that the companies grow up in. And we don't have to resort to thinking about matters of unfair pricing and antitrust issues to understand all of this. I'll skip over that. And I should just mention, by the way, it's remarkable that Steven managed to figure out from just the time series data on firms' output prices and patents so much about how industries work, all the way through that 1996 AER paper. So I think he did some incredible detective work at the time. Okay, now when I joined Carnegie Mellon as a PhD student, I got into looking at specific industries. He told me that he had long had the idea of researching the history of industries to figure out more about this, but he hadn't done anything like this yet. And so I dug into how is it that industries are happening. My research goal was to understand what causes industry shakeouts, testing out different ideas. And so it turned out to be exciting. The first thing I looked into was this notion coming from Abernathy and Utterback that product standardization might drive this. And so Utterback and Suarez had written this paper suggesting that dominant designs trigger industry shakeouts. And their work originated especially in the automobile industry, for which they had said that the all-steel closed-body car triggered new production requirements. And those new production requirements, firms would have to adapt to doing this. They would no longer be able to get in with new variants of the product. And if they failed to adapt successfully to this product standardization, they would be driven to exit. Well, so I started looking into it. The first thing I found is that the data source that was used, it came from a 1966 PhD dissertation, and for its own good reasons, it had left out every make that exited before the year 1923. So really, that meant that the number of firms was higher earlier. And it looked like they had kind of concocted this story. Indeed, the number of firms reached a peak in 1909. And so that's an exciting way to start out your PhD research, I guess. And then, so digging into a lot more evidence from all kinds of different sources, it became clear that product standards continued evolving. There was not a simple shift from product to process innovation, and that that any one particular standard seemed to have a limited impact, not just in automobiles, but in other products that we studied. Another view that existed at the time was about technological shocks that perhaps, for example, increased the scale of the firm. And Jovanovich and McDonald had calibrated a model to the tire industry and suggested a couple possibilities for what was doing this. One is the Banbury mixer, which I have indicated here. And in fact, it turned out that mixing was a relatively small part of it's shown right here, of the manufacturing process. And when you dug into how much change was going on in different parts, it didn't look like as much change was happening in the washing, milling, compounding, and calendaring parts of the process where the mixing was. Rather, there was more happening in other parts. This chart shows the percentage of employment displaced by year. And so you can see there's a lot going on in other cases. And in general, when you looked at different parts of this is a part where you're actually building the tires, it didn't seem like scale was the main issue. We also looked at the survival patterns of firms. So the shock view suggests that you would have some time with an event, and at that time, the probability of exit of firms would rise. But then as companies that survived adapted, only the successful adapted firms would be the ones that would survive, the hazard of exit should converge for these firms. In actual data, we saw a rather different pattern. We also saw a rather different pattern in the histories when we looked for particular events in these products. And that's when the shakeout began, is when that blue curve is shown. And when we look across all these different products, it just didn't seem that that was the story. So what did happen, this kind of wraps up what Steven's theory says. The exit rate was typically somewhat constant over time. What really changed is that entry stopped in industries. And with little entry but continuing exit of firms, the number of companies would go down. There was an early mover advantage. Some of the early entering companies became the leaders in the industry. You can see that in market shares, but you can also see that in survival patterns, where early entering companies have, on these sorts of plots of the percentage of firms surviving, these are logarithmic, the early entrants have survival rates that are much higher. Their chance of exit, which is the slope on this logarithmic graph, got more flat over time, whereas later entrants had much worse chance of survival. So why did this happen? Well, some people had kind of looked at advertising and other related issues, but when people did, like in the television receiver industry, they just didn't find that seemed to explain much about survival. But when we put together the data on innovation, so I went to lots of different sources, dug up lists of who was innovating and matched it up to the data, and the innovators were surviving and growing a lot more than other firms, and the innovators were those firms that were larger and earlier entering. They were dominating the innovation, giving this sort of spiral that propelled them to stay ahead of other firms. Early entrants would end up larger, they would innovate more, grow more, and that would keep them ahead of the competition. Digging into the technology, these are some of the most rapidly technologically progressive industries. And so these industries chosen to be industries that have very severe shakeouts, right away you can see there seems to be something going on there with technological change. The leading firms dominated at technological innovation. The innovators were much less likely to exit. So on this chart, you see a hazard rate versus time in the automobile industry. At the bottom, we have innovators. At the top, we have non-innovators. So those companies that were coming up with innovations were far ahead in their survival chances. And that shows up across all 4 of those products that were studied at the time. Since I have done cross-industry, cross-nation studies to get at more of this and try to explain why some industries don't have shakeouts. Stephen always viewed shakeouts as a stylized fact of industries, but this is where I've differed with him. I've kind of wanted to say, well, some industries really don't have something going on, and let's explain that. We see similar patterns in the matched industries across countries. I'm going to skip over that. Since then, and at the same time, there's been a profusion of different ideas. So people have talked about theories of learning, of course, driving industries. That's very similar to Klepper's own work, and similar in spirit, some minor differences, including the diffusion issue that I talked about before. Overconfidence and over-entry. Maybe you've got lots of people getting in because they want to make a buck and they think this is a good chance to do it, but there's over-entry and then they all have to get out of the industry. Competition across submarkets that could indeed cause or contribute to the shakeouts. It could cause if one submarket replaces another, as in Christensen's work on disruption, but maybe originating from established firms. Geographic differentiation could hinder a shakeout, as could other types of differentiation. Imports could cause shakeouts. We certainly saw that in Meiji-era Japan earlier this morning, for example. And that and a lot of other issues could play into the international context. If you start asking, for example, how is it that in an industry with such a strong shakeout where this dynamic pertains that foreign producers could take over versus U.S. producers in the automotive industry? You get into a whole rich set of interesting questions. Transaction dependencies, competitive games, technological uncertainty, that is, which technology is going to work out well, so you can invest, but some people will then pull out because they made the wrong choice. Vintage capital, maybe if you invested in old capital and you're going to have to pull out eventually because you can't compete anymore as price goes down. Investments to avoid a chance of disastrously having to shut down. They could be technological or other sorts of investments in a model applied to banking. Environmental regulation may be driving exit. And in the organizational ecology literature, you get this notion of density delay, which to me seems a bit mechanistic. But anyway, you can see a whole range of ideas now that people are putting out on what could be causing industry shakeouts. And I think some of these are perfectly valid. Some of them are terrible work, and Steven would certainly have gladly pointed that out. But there are some really good ideas in there, too. I think in some cases they are telling us what happens in a few cases. In other cases they are telling us what adds to Steven's story. And but anyway, there's a lot of rich, nice stuff there. I think there are some interesting open questions that remain. On the underpinnings, some interesting issues to investigate include adjustment processes of firm size, determinants of potential entry, as Rajshri talked about this morning, persistence and change in firm skill levels, because in his model it persists, and there are interesting issues to do with that. Strategic games, as the number of firms is getting really small, so you would think strategy should matter, strategic interaction should matter. Contrasting industry dynamics, why don't you have a shakeout sometimes? What's driving that? The role of disruptive technological change, shakeouts in non-manufacturing industries, international differences. So there's actually a huge set of questions, despite all the work that's been done, that really deserves further investigation, especially issues of economic growth and national competitiveness, dear to my heart, as Sid was getting at this morning. And within the firm, there's a whole linked set of questions to look at. So in conclusion, my view is that the Klepperian model of industry shakeouts is on target in that it's the dominant pattern that fits most, at least severe shakeouts. Now, nobody has really asked the question of, well, what about sort of medium shakeouts or just a little bit shakeout? What's driving those cases? You might get a different answer there. We have a process of R&D-driven dynamic increasing returns in these industries that have really substantial shakeouts. Some details of the model are questionable. I'd love to have a long conversation about that, but that will have to wait for another time. So the other profusion of theories has pointed out that certainly there can be different reasons for industry shakeouts, and that we can have aspects to add to Steven's model to enrich it, to say more about what's going on in industries, to do with, for example, learning, submarkets, and strategic interactions. It would be hard to deny that these are totally irrelevant. And so finally, I hope that there'll be a lot further study on this. Maybe this has triggered some ideas for people to go on and do more. I believe the international evolution of this, for example, deserves lots of attention. But the dominant insight, I believe, still remains that this is a race to keep up in innovation that is driving what happens in industry shakeouts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You did an awesome job of staying within schedule, so I'd like to reward all of us by taking 5 minutes to take some questions from the audience. Maybe we could collect 3 or 4 questions and then have you respond to them. Questions or reactions to Ken's presentation? Yes, sorry.
So one thing which I think what very important message that you conveyed here is that it is the innovators who survive and non-innovators who exit. And then there was a link from this to early entrance and firm size. Is that really, so these two things conceptually at least are separate, right? Yes, there is the R&D escalation theory, which Wes and Steven developed, where there is this advantage of size. But we can think of other things. And well, given your work on a broad range of industries, have you encountered a pattern where innovators and the survivors in the shakeout are actually not large-sized early entrants, but something else?
Great question. Can we also collect one from Matt and then one from Wes?
So maybe I have an anomaly for you. So I've studied the speech recognition industry, which has been around since 1952. So plenty of time for a shakeout, but no shakeout. Hundreds of companies still active, still growing. And if you look at where the consolidation has been, it's actually the innovators that have been acquired and rolled up by Nuance Communications, like how we're searing a bunch of stuff. But there are hundreds of peripheral firms in various parts of the value chain still going strong. So I'd love to discuss that more with you. Because it seems...
Sorry.
Ken, so as you pointed out earlier in your talk, there's some industries that Steve was acutely aware of, and he was challenged by lasers, for some time, where shakeouts are not particularly pronounced. They don't happen, and he had explanations and so on, market segmentation, heterogeneous preferences, and so. Maybe you don't have this, but I wonder if there's some sort of census, if you will, or some sampling across industries that tell us, well, in how many industries, say even within manufacturing, do you see shakeouts versus this absence of this pronounced pattern? As you say, there's undoubtedly a lot of action in between those two polar cases as well. So I guess just how common, uncommon one pattern versus the other, etc. If you have any sense of that, maybe just the profession isn't to the point where we really can claim such a sense, as we have obviously a selected sample of industries, unfortunately, and hope that other work is done. But please.
Yeah, so besides the sort of studies of the large group of industries that originated from the sample that Michael Gort had, there's not much to go on. There have been efforts to use the longitudinal census data to get at the issue of industry shakeouts, but it doesn't really give us that same sort of time span and precision of defining an industry. So it's hard to tell in that sense. So we, at this stage, I think, have impressions that there are a reasonable number of industries that, at least for a long time, don't have much of a shakeout. And of course, there could be some reason that something eventually happens, but that sort of suggests that that's not sort of the process that Steven talked about is not the main process driving what happens in those industries. But I don't have exact numbers. On the first issue, disruption obviously sometimes creates an opportunity. It's the opposite of what Steven talked about, for new entrants to take over from old. And there are cases like that. Now, the literature on technological disruption has many different ways of thinking. Sometimes people think of disruption when you've got an established firm like Michelin with the radial tire that takes over from other established firms. But in a sense, that's kind of still consistent with Steven's view. It's just a really major innovation. The alternative is more the Christensen view or the Henderson view of what has happened in certain industries where new entrants manage to take over from incumbent firms. And I would say there we have a lot more to learn about how often that happens. I've been doing research on the frequency of that, but the answers are not all in yet from the literature on how and how often this happens. Finally, on the issue of nuance acquisitions, for example, in speech recognition, in Steven's model, you have to remember that technology has to get done inside of firms. You can't buy this from outside suppliers. That is, if an outside supplier develops a new technology, it can't successfully patent and defend that technology and sell it to everybody. How are you going to do this for little manufacturing changes or product feature changes in huge numbers, but nonetheless they're little individually, and they may be ones that require some different needs for different companies. So it doesn't work practically for a lot of the kinds of innovation that have to go on in industry to have it done third party and sold. Especially in developing really new technologies, new products, that's where there's more opportunity for acquisition either of the technology or of the company to bring an innovation inside a company. And so that distinction, and for example, that means a big distinction versus pharmaceuticals. That distinction means that industries in which you can really capture the rights to technology strongly most of the time, which I think are rare, would be expected to have a different dynamic. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much. Kim has set...
Opportunity to present this paper. I'm one of the students of Steven Klepper. I especially want to thank David Hamerschlag for providing the support to travel here. So I want to present here a paper that I've been working on. Steven has actually supported the acquisition of these data, but he never actually saw the paper in its current form. So this paper is about how product customization affects firm survival. And in this paper, I talk about two mechanisms. One is market pioneering and how firms that engage in product customization find survival premium because of the market pioneering that happens. But also I want to talk about entry deterrence and how that can also, as a separate channel, provide additional survival premium. So to motivate why we need to take a look at product customization, I want to go back to the earlier presentations in the morning and how they have made this a motivation for their own presentations. We know relatively less about industries that are intensive in customization as to how they evolve. This is a point that Anderson and Tushman make in their 1990 paper, where they argue that in product classes where there is lots and lots of product customization, it is not clear that they actually go through these shakeouts. So there is a motivation there to understand how these industries that feature customization more intensively evolve. Second, there is a growing importance of customization if you look at the data. So in the international trade data, there is some statistics that indicate that intermediate inputs that actually go into one final product are actually increasingly becoming a larger fraction of the overall intermediate input trade relative to those that are more generic and fit into a larger number of final products. Third, if you think about product customization more generally, mostly it's the marketing scholars who have contributed in this space. And the manner in which they think about customization is perhaps towards one end of the spectrum, where they are focusing on small changes to products and how those can actually increase the willingness to pay for consumers. What I have in mind, and perhaps this is something that also comes up in submarkets literature that Steven has pioneered, is that when you have product customization, it can actually open up new submarkets and serve unmet needs. So it may be that on the one hand, product customization involves trivial changes and small increases in willingness to pay. But at the other end of the spectrum, you can have product customization lead to new markets, right? And the point is that the earlier empirical work has largely been about how Dell allows customization and how that is a business model, that's a successful business model, etc. But this later kind of customization has not been empirically investigated. Finally, there is also this growing view that customizers are actually firms that have this generative capability, appropriability. So Ahuja et al. Have this paper where they talk about, besides the primary appropriability regime that Wes and others have talked about, Ahuja is talking about a generative appropriability where the effectiveness in exploiting new inventions as concepts and capturing a share of the future inventions they spawn. So this is not just about this particular invention and whether you can extract revenues from it completely by yourself, but also about thinking about additional inventions in the future and to what extent can you actually capture value from these additional innovations that follow from this, this concept that you have invented. So these form the motivation for the paper. So I have two sets of hypotheses that I investigate in this paper. The first set of hypotheses are closely related to the submarkets literature that Steven talks about. In that context, product customization activity essentially reflects knowledge a firm possesses about how the core technology can be modified to an emerging customer need, and a firm competence to adapt to market obsolescence. So in this view, product customization results in a market pioneering that can lead to sustained competitive advantage. So if you think about the Klepper-Thompson submarkets model, and you introduce two sets of firms with heterogeneous probabilities of entering any new submarket that is newly created, and if you assume that firms that have product customization capability have a slightly higher probability of entering a newly created market, then you can see how firms that possess this customization capability actually have a broader scope and also are the firms that enter into a larger set of markets. So in that sense, we have this hypothesis, which I call the pioneering effect hypothesis, where product customization activity is positively related to firm scope and survival, right? So above and beyond this baseline pioneering effect, if you can think about various industries, to the extent that some industries have this pioneering, have this submarket arrival rate that is higher than others, you actually see a stronger pioneering effect in industries where the rate of arrival of submarkets is higher. In addition, at a different level of analysis, at the submarket level of analysis, I pursue two additional hypotheses that are slightly competing. When firms engage in customization activity in a market, there have been theoretical papers that suggest that that can act as a deterrent to future entry. So overinvestment in costly customization can actually deter entry. There is two papers that are very proximate to this idea. One is this Devanjing and Seidman paper. But also Anita Megan is a paper where she's arguing that even if you don't engage in this capacity-based deterrent strategy, incumbents can invest in excess capacity, and that can be a source of deterrence for later entrants. Even if that kind of a mechanism is muted, you can still have asymmetric learning about buyer acceptance as a mechanism that can create entry deterrence. So on the one hand, you have these kinds of models that suggest that overinvestment in customization can actually dampen later entry into the industry, and that can be a separate source of product survival, superior survival, relative to others. And then you can also think about this other literature, which is more in the organizational sociology kind of literature, where firms that are successful, which are in this case customizing firms to the extent that customization affords superior survival, later entrants would want to enter more to imitate that kind of a behavior. So I pursue these two hypotheses in this at the market level. So the first hypothesis is this deterrent effect. The greater the fraction of firms that undertake product customization activity in period T-1, the lower is the extent of entry and the number of firms in period T. Slightly competing hypothesis is this imitation effect, which says that the greater the fraction of firms that undertake product customization activity in T-1, the greater is the extent of entry by firms that undertake product customization in period T. So we basically test these ideas in the laser industry because there is an empirical challenge here that is quite significant. You first have to identify an industry where product customization has a higher likelihood of leading to sub-market pioneering in some industries. You also have to compare this to other industries that are very proximate to the focal industry, where similar changes to product customization does not necessarily lead to higher levels of sub-market pioneering. And you also have to observe which firms do this kind of customization and which firms don't. So it turns out that there is a source called Photonic Spectra Buyer's Guide, which actually has this kind of information, which I exploit to do this particular work. So they actually, for the entire sample of firms in the industry, not just in the US, but outside the US as well, they collect information on an annual basis about various products that laser firms and associated product market firms are producing. And in addition to that, they ask whether this particular firm in a particular product market is producing the stock version of the product, or whether it's a firm that also undertakes product customization activity, also design activity, and distribution and supply activity, right? So we put these data together. These are spanning a large number of industries that are closely associated to the laser industry. To be specific, there are 13 different product industries that I'm going to call them. At the top, you have laser device industry, which features about 80 different products and 15,000 different observations, firm-year observations, spanning about 1,000 different companies. Then you have the downstream laser industry, which basically involves system producers which incorporate lasers and into various products such as the a laser pointer or lasers for eye surgery, etc., right? Overall, this data set has about 500,000, little over 400,000 observations. And for each firm, product market, product year observation, I know whether there is actually customization involved by that firm or not. So there is a challenge in terms of identification. Customization can be pretty endogenous, as better firms are more likely to customize. So ideally what you would want to see is exploit some kind of a within firm variation in terms of its customization activity to control for unobserved firm specific factors that may be driving this. But what I see in the data is that there is very little within firm over time variation in customization activity at the product market level. So that is something that I cannot really exploit. So if you do include fixed effects in some of these regressions, you will have a very small number of observations with which you can do this estimation. Instead, what I do is I exploit between firm variation and between industry variation in customization to test these hypotheses. You will see that there are a rich set of market and firm controls that mitigate omitted variable bias to a large extent. Data are census of firms in these industries, so that to some extent controls, addresses the selection bias. But you will also see that I will show you certain regressions which support these hypotheses in the upstream laser industry, but they are not supported in the downstream laser system industry, where I argue that product customization does not necessarily lead to the kind of market pioneering that you see in the upstream industry, right? So the kind of regressions that specifications that we use are very similar to Rajshri Agarwal's 2009 paper with her co-authors. The difference between those regressions and the ones that I'll show you is that besides these complementary log-log regressions at the industry level, because I'm going to be comparing across industries, that I'll be able to sort of do some kind of a falsification as well to do this. And then the second set of hypotheses are tested using these negative binomial count models. So quickly the results. So what I'm estimating here is the likelihood of survival. The dependent variable is whether or not a firm survives. And what you see is at the baseline, custom, the coefficient estimate of custom is negative and significant, which shows that whatever your explanation may be for why customization affords superior survival, that is captured in the custom coefficient estimate. It is negative and significant. What we are particularly interested in is the interaction term between custom and laser, which suggests that customization affords a greater survival premium in the laser industry because it allows for greater extent of sub-market pioneering. You don't see the same effect if you interact custom with system by taking out laser industry observations. So that indicates that this is an effect that is unique to the laser industry and not to the system industry. And then I pursue a similar set of similar identification strategy at the market level, where I test the impact on the number of new entrants tomorrow, given the fraction of entrants that do customization today. And I find that there is a significant deterrence effect that is even more pronounced for in the laser industry, but similar effects are not seen in the systems industry. So indeed, the product customization is actually leading laser firms to deter later entrants more than the baseline effect in the data set that is applicable to all firms in the industry that engage in customization. So similar regressions are also used to test the imitative entry hypothesis, but you don't see that greater extent of customizers in today's market actually leads to greater imitators tomorrow. So we find support for deterrence effect, but not for imitation effect. So this is a more clear test of the survival, and you see that the interaction term between the fraction of firms that do customization and the laser industry has significantly negative and significant coefficient estimate, indicating that more customizers today is actually leading to fewer entrants tomorrow. So in terms of contribution, this sort of complements a larger body of literature that tries to model this trade-off between exploration and exploitation. And here we are arguing that there are these dynamic indirect effects at the market level, which perhaps have not been modeled in the existing literature, right? And this empirical work perhaps can motivate incorporation of these strategic effects at various levels of analysis into these submarkets based models of industry evolution that Steven has contributed. Thank you.
And we are actually ahead of time. So again, I want to reward all of us by taking some questions from the floor and having a bit of discussion. So does anybody have any questions? Yes, Ken.
I wonder if the incentives and processes for customization might have had to do here with the fact that user input could have been important in coming up with innovations in lasers.
Yeah. Maybe we could collect a couple of questions. Are there other questions for Ajay? Yes, in the very back. Yes, Ashish.
So what do the guys who buy the standard lasers don't customize them?
Okay.
Do you know what happens?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
So there is.
Yeah, can we just collect one more because there was a hand over here?
All right. This is very brief, and it's actually, I guess, really relates to both questions. I was thinking in the paper on the tire industry that first movers, early firms seem to have an advantage and are also more innovative. And I'm wondering if one can parse out, is that because more innovative firms actually enter the industry even as a sub-market, or is it something else, or even some other first mover advantage, and they just happen to be innovative? We'll just leave it at that.
And you can take those in any order.
Okay.
May I ask one more?
Sure.
So you had this previous research where you showed that firms that integrated, at least temporarily, tended to be better and survive better. So do you find any correlation between this previous result with integration benefit survival and the new findings? So in other words, were those firms that temporarily integrated from devices into systems, or from systems and devices, were there also firms that did more customization with this no relationship, or is it the reverse? Have I looked at that?
Yeah, and there's one more question in the back. Well, we have a luxury of time, so Brad, go ahead.
Thank you. So I may not have followed as closely or understood as well enough the industry definition, like what is laser and what is not, but I was kind of wondering if we were to look at other industries such as autos or tires with a more holistic definition, because it seems like those would fit into the same industry according to this definition, if we would see similar patterns. Are we a little bit comparing apples and oranges across these various studies? It's not in a bad way, but kind of in a good way.
Okay. All right.
Now for the response.
Okay. So to Sergey's point, I have vertical integration as a control variable in this. So I'm trying to control for vertical integration and then predict what is the impact of baseline customization, and then whether there is an additional effect in the laser industry. So I'm interested in the coefficient estimate on custom times laser, and I control for vertical integration. I'm not theorizing about the impact of vertical integration on survival and how there may be additional effects for customizers as opposed to the others. But to go back to Ashish's question, in these data, you often find that there is within firm, within product variation in terms of whether they do standardized product or they customize or they do both or they do a subset of these five, which is...
I meant the buyers, the guys who buy it. What do they do with the camera? Because otherwise this is a story of who is more efficient at customizing them. And I'm not sure what to make of this stuff.
So your question is which buyer, so I'm trying to, can you state the question again? I'm sorry.
So let me give you an analogy. You can buy trousers and get them fitted at home. Or you turn the seams up and that's customization. Or you can get them at the store. I'm trying to think about, is that what I should have in mind, or is there something more complicated going on?
So there is a small qualitative case in the paper where I discuss why a buyer needs a customized product in the first place. It is largely in the laser industry because there is some technological change, there is some information, new information that gets revealed. For example, that in the particular case that I discuss in the paper, that they find that a new wavelength of laser can actually help in hearing aids. So there is no hearing aid that actually uses optical sort of technology to do this. And so somebody has to create this new device that essentially involves tinkering with your existing device, creating a new device at a slightly different wavelength, but that tinkering actually leads to a completely different functionality, right? So that is the kind of customization that we have in mind. So on the one extreme, as I said, customization can be changes to color of the car and really trivial changes. On the other extreme, even if you have trivial or incremental or marginal changes to the product, that can lead to substantially new, functionally different products and lead to new market pioneering. So that's the distinction that we are exploiting here. In terms of Ken's question about whether users, can you please state the question again, whether user input is?
I wondered if the patterns you're observing here might be unusual because of the potential for user innovation. User innovation and the ideas coming from users benefiting firms in a way that might not be true in other industries. And so I was trying to think through those issues. I don't know how much you know about that process.
So in terms of the regressions, to the extent that that is a factor that should be in the baseline effect on customization. For example, if user innovation is important, then to the extent that it is important for all industries that are in my data set, it should be captured by the baseline custom coefficient estimate. To the extent that it is particularly more important for firms in the laser industry, that would be consistent with my results. And firms that engage in customization maybe are the firms that also have superior mechanisms to interact with users from where they are drawing their inputs. So that would be consistent with the story, I would say. I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm trying to defend these regressions. There was a question there that, so to your question about first mover advantages, there is so these data are basically based on a smaller sample of data from 1997 to 2009. But there is a larger data set on lasers that goes back to the 1960s, which is where in a different paper there is a discussion of the extent of first mover advantages. So the point there was that for a long time in the laser industry, you did not have first mover advantages for early entrants until a technological change actually unleashed the kind of R&D escalation that was mentioned earlier. It's only after 1988 and the discovery of these diode pumped solid-state lasers that you actually begin to see first mover advantages in effect. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I first want to thank the organizers, Sergey, Francisco, and especially David for really Herculean efforts putting this together, and boy, are they making the trains run on time here. This is quite impressive. And I also particularly want to say just what a wonderful way this is to honor Steve's memory and, in particularly, his work. This is really a wonderful occasion. This is joint work with Ashish Arora. Happily, I'm happy. Happily, my colleague at Duke. What we'll do is I'll present the material, and Ashish is batting cleanup. Okay. So he'll be taking care of all the challenging and unanswerable questions and rectify all errors made during the presentation. And I also want to give a little warning here, which is there are no data here. And by the way, my selection of words here is very careful and also honors Steve's memory. There are no data here. I don't know, it took several years before Steve drummed in my head the fact that data is, as a word, plural. Okay, with that, it's a theoretical model. And what we're trying to look at here is the relationship between industry market structure and the impact of public support for R&D on technical advance within industries. Let me define a little bit what I mean by market structure. Essentially, the number and size distribution of firms within markets. Okay, in our simple model, we keep the distribution pretty simple, i.e. uniform. It's the same. They're the same size. And when we talk about public support for technical advance, we're talking about really it should apply to all of these, from supply side policies where perhaps product innovation within an industry is subsidized by the government, process innovation, even upstream basic research, which in turn would act as, if you will, a subsidy to downstream product, process, etc., depending on the particular case. And we're even talking about demand-side policies. Sally, mission-driven government procurement, for example, Department of Defense. What I'll be talking about in particular, though, assuming I get there, is subsidies to the adoption of new products, like electric cars, okay? And how might that affect, the effect of such policies depend on this number and size distribution of firms within markets. So what's the contribution here? You know, there's a large literature, which I will not detail at all, about effects of government policies, government subsidy on innovation within industries, but this literature takes little account, okay, of the effect of firm size or market structure on that impact. Okay, now I say little, I haven't seen any, but I'm hedging my bets here, so if anybody's seen any, please bring it to my attention. And what this paper does is propose a theoretical model grounded in the empirical literature that shows how government support, how the effect of that support on the rate of and direction of technical advance may indeed vary with the number and size distribution of firms within industries. Now, surprise, what am I talking about here in terms of empirical literature? Okay, yes, this is and Ken kindly cited work, as did a couple of others before, work that I did with Steve, a couple of publications in 1996, where, as is also reflected in the models of industry evolution, some of them that we've talked about here, this notion of R&D cost spreading that yields an advantage to R&D in firm size. So basically, you know, the larger the level of output, the greater the return to the R&D that was expended in developing the innovation that goes into that output. Simple cost spreading, but not so simple. There are assumptions that underpin that, and there are really two key assumptions in the model. One is came up in the discussion with Ken before. There's the assumption of what you might call limited appropriability, that firms work on the assumption that they can really only appropriate the returns to their innovation by embodying those innovations in their own output. Why? Because of well-known failures in innovation markets, if you will. Okay, but there's another assumption here, and by the way, this notion of cost spreading, what Steve and I really did with it is try to explain what I claim to be the most pervasive and most robust stylized fact in the literature on innovation. Okay, that is a monotonic relationship, often linear, between R&D and firm size. So this was the rationale, this was the theory that we were able to use to explain that. But there's a second underpinning assumption that I'm talking about, that for that relationship to hold, firms have to believe that whatever they come up with at a moment in time is not going to spur rapid and discontinuous innovation, that they're not going to be able to, say, take over the industry with their new thing. So it's rather more incremental in its effect. Now, this is critical to the argument that follows. This relationship, this cost-spreading character of innovation actually varies across different types of R&D, across different types of innovation within firms. In his evolutionary model, Steve clearly emphasized process R&D. And the point is that we can say, well, the degree to which a firm comes up with really a significantly new product, that might spur this rapid growth. And maybe they can sell this in disembodied form. So that relationship won't be quite so clear there. Whereas for a process, or perhaps very incremental change, there is this exploitation, if you will, of an existing market, of an installed base. So this is important to our argument that types of R&D can be distinguished on the basis of the extent to which there is such a cost-spreading advantage or not. Okay. Now, this raises some questions. Okay. The question is well, how the effect of government policies that support then these different types of R&D, each subject to different degrees of cost spreading, may be conditioned by the number and size distribution of firms within industries. Okay, is a question that then's raised by this prior insight. And the second point, it even raises the question of how policies that support, say, growth and demand for a given industry depend upon whether those policies actually encourage entry, okay, or increase the sales volume of incumbents rather than entry, therefore, playing to this cost-spreading advantage. To guide the intuition in 10 minutes that I have here, we're going to throw up a little model. I'll make this very brief. So in our simple model, firms are basically assumed to perform two types of R&D. Process, tied to their output, okay? Product, not tied to their output. We just impose those strict assumptions, and we're going to assume that industry output is fixed, and the number of firms not really given. As n increases, average size of the firm comes down, vice versa, okay, within our little setup. And we're going to assume, standard assumption, diminishing marginal productivity of R&D. For the purpose of this presentation, we'll also assume increased costs of R&D, meaning perhaps rationalized by notions of span of control in the R&D function. That the bigger the operation, the more difficult just to control this, less efficient becomes R&D. There it is. I will save you the pain. Okay. So where the firm's payoff from R&D is a function of this alpha times Qn, X1, that type of R&D that's tied to firm size, where the returns are tied to firm size, and then one that's untied, unrelated to firm size. Okay, and that the impact on V, think of it even as a productivity boost, is characterized there by beta. I can go through this to give you some just simple assumptions, and we crank out, what's this look like for the firm, what's this look like then for the industry, given our assumptions. But basically what we find is process R&D increases with firm size, but at a diminishing rate. By the way, the diminishing rate is due to this increasing cost assumption, which is also built in here. Product R&D decreases with firm size. And so as firms grow larger, at the firm level, the firm will spend more on process and less on product, okay? And total R&D increases with firm size, but at a diminishing rate. So here's some basic intuition. Let me jump down to the industry level of analysis, where what this means at the level of the industry is larger but fewer firms will result in less process and lower product R&D and lower total R&D. Because, and in fact, increasing cost is an important assumption here, which is why despite the fact as firm size increases, process will increase due to diminishing, basically increasing cost to R&D. You end up with a lower process at the industry level, and of course, lower total as total R&D because of also lower product as essentially R&D is shifted over to process innovation. Now, here are the policy levers. So think of that as a policy lever affecting process, policy lever affecting productivity, if you will, of product. Perhaps we rationalize these as subsidies to process and product. The cost of R&D, perhaps reflecting R&D, tax credit. Demand side subsidies, perhaps reflected as subsidies to the purchase of solar panels or electric vehicles. Okay, let me focus for the sake of being succinct on this right here. What this says, with the arithmetic, with the cross partials here, it's saying, okay, let's assume the government comes in, subsidizes process or subsidizes product. I'll focus on product, but this is, of course, it'll increase product R&D spending, but then what's happening within the industry? As average firm size increases, that positive effect is diminished. Okay, so the government's getting less of a bang to the in solar panel development, although that's what it wants, to the degree that those industries are more concentrated, what I'm saying there, as average size. And indeed, even total R&D for that firm is going to come down. So there are going to be these unintended consequences of these subsidies, okay, depending on, the market structure. So just a couple of implications. This basically puts in words what I just say. So the more concentrated the solar panel industry, the less a subsidy to solar panel development will stimulate product and total R&D. I'll skip this for the sake of time. Anybody want the slides? I'm happy to provide them. Robotics. I was here with the Robotics Center at CMU, funded by NSF. Okay, this applies directly to that. Okay, that's upstream research, but it's a subsidy to essentially innovation for firms that manufacture robotics. Okay, and what we're saying is the positive effect on robotics is lower the more concentrated is the robotics industry. But this gets even more interesting. Say those robots developed, by these robot companies, benefiting from Carnegie's research. Okay, those are fed into a downstream company. Let's call it a General Motors. Okay, which actually is true. Okay, well then let's, to the degree that robotics development makes that process R&D more efficient downstream. Okay, what happens there? And in fact, what we see is that, assuming, again, increasing cost, that subsidy will stimulate users' even process innovation, GM's process innovation, less the more concentrated is that downstream industry. Okay, that's, so in other words, this doesn't just affect a given industry, put it in a vertical chain, and it can have some pretty interesting and, again, unintended consequences, if you will. And when I say it affects the process innovation, I mean, sure, GM did tons of process R&D trying to integrate robotics into their manufacturing processes, and that's what we're talking about there. Okay, R&D tax credit, sure, it stimulates both types, but in our model we show that a more concentrated market will attenuate the positive effects of that tax credit. Ashish will elaborate that later. Let's get on to the next more interesting one. This is the last major point. What happens to industry R&D if market demand is increased, subsidized? If market demand is subsidized, increasing, therefore, big Q, the output level of the industry. So again, solar panels, electric cars, that's what we're talking about. What happens to the R&D in that industry? Well, here, what it really depends on is industry dynamics. What happens with incumbent size and what's happening with entry, okay, and that's key. And we have two views of the world here. Call it the Chicago view and the Klepper view, okay? The Chicago view. The market equilibrates and N increases, and each firm's output goes back to its original level. Okay, so the only thing that changes there is N under the Chicago view. Under Klepper, Klepper has these dominant firms, so we have sort of a more mature industry in our head, back of our heads here, the way Steve thought about this, that are essentially blockade entry. The only thing that happens there is no entry, output increases. Okay, so number of firms, N remains unchanged and Q increases. So think of these as two polar cases that can really frame a discussion. And why isn't this advancing? Guys, here we go. So I'll focus right here. So basically under the Chicago view, we say big Q is changing, but the only thing changing there is N, that component of big Q. Whereas here, big Q changing, the only thing changing there is a little q, is the output level for the firm. And what we have here, which is interesting, in fact, what that means is that product R&D in that subsidized industry, okay, so will actually go down. So you're subsidizing the purchase of electric vehicles, and my gosh, product R&D in the guys making those electric vehicles diminishes. Okay, so again, very important to have an understanding of this. Now, there's a little asterisk there. If you impose marginal constant marginal cost, that basically there's no effect on product. But the point is in this view of the world, process goes up, but with either a negative or no effect. Okay, on product R&D. Albeit an increase in total R&D. So, in other words, what we have here is clear implications, not just for the rate, but for the direction of technical advance, which originating from a broad range of government policies due to, okay, the number and size distribution of firms within industries. So a subsidy will, under the Chicago regime, encourage both product and process, but under Klepper, with barred entry, firms will only increase their process innovation, okay, and they decrease, or at best, do no more product R&D. So while such a subsidy will encourage R&D, you can see the slide as well. What kind of R&D will be encouraged depends upon this issue of market structure. So in conclusion, okay, very good. The number and size distribution of firms within an industry will condition, in our view, the impact of public support on both the rate and direction of technical advance, and that this impact is a function of the degree to which there is, one, a cost-spreading advantage to large size in R&D, but more specifically, the degree to which that advantage is tied more to one type of R&D versus another. So it might not be product process, it might be incremental product versus significant product, for example. You could do the same model and just use those words instead. And it also depends on the degree to which R&D is subject to increasing cost. Now, a big question remains. Does this matter? How much? So we have it in theory. We don't know the facts. It would be great to do some empirical research on this question, because we'd be curious about how important these effects are. And Ashish, it is now all yours. So all the tough questions, guys, go to Ashish.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, so there were hands up even before you stopped. Sorry, people trying to get in. So I think, Guido, you have the first question.
Great work. I was wondering, do you distinguish that Chicago situation where N goes up and the Klepper situation, as you call it, where N is constant? But there might also be what I would call the Bhaskara-Butler-Klepper situation where N goes down, because the demand shock basically triggers the shakeout.
Oh,
can we take a few questions?
Okay, okay, you're taxing our memory, but Ashish is going to go.
That's right, you got two people. Sergey.
So, leaving the distinction between product and process innovation aside for a moment, if I understood your model correctly, well, your basic logic, so I was kind of listening to you and sort of thinking, you managed to get this implication of the market structure without ever mentioning anything what many people would have thought is going on there, how competitive the industry is. And the way you were able to do that is by assuming convex R&D costs. And of course, when you have convex costs, then you want to split the firms, actually make them as small as possible, because that's the most efficient way of doing R&D.
That's right.
So it was kind of a mechanical way to derive this. So I'm just wondering if you're really serious about this, about convex R&D, maybe some incentives and competition have something to do with it too.
Okay, and one more question, Susan. Sally, sorry.
So I told my boss that I had to come to this conference because I was going to come back with some answers. It's hard to believe that the DoD is a small customer or a niche customer with $500 billion, but it's been going down so fast. A lot of that is procurement, but procurement depends on people investing in R&D. So what we see now is that lack of investment in R&D. The Undersecretary has convinced Secretary Hagel that the way to go after this is to encourage prototyping, and that we will encourage prototyping. Process R&D doesn't bother us right now. That's all around production. We have ways for investing directly in process R&D. Product R&D is much more nuanced than simply product R&D. We're talking about basic research, and we're talking about things that get across that valley of death. So I want to know in this, given that we have decreasing quantities and those quantities aren't expected to go up, how do we encourage industry to still invest in that product R&D under your model? Wes?
No, Ashish.
Yes.
I hesitate to ask you to tackle more, but you guys are kind of talking about carrots here, and I'm interested in sticks too. So I wonder if you would also, think about how to game out how different kind of regulatory mechanisms would play out against this same issue of market structure.
Just clarify, sticks, what do you have in mind?
Performance standards, for instance, versus standards that push process in chemical firms, for instance.
Interesting.
Environmental standards.
Yeah.
Okay. You guys want to tackle that first round? As you wish.
All right, so I'd like to give you one. Yes, if N goes down, then Klepper will say for theory. Sadly, I'll let Wes answer.
That's not fair. You're leaving the tough one.
let me address Sergey's point. So, so just a brief background. The paper started, Wes was telling me about this size, diversity trade-off. That doesn't make any sense. So, this was an attempt to show that what Wes was telling me was wrong. He was right. I just had to figure it out. But in the end, we got a paper. So my mistake was exactly yours. So the reason we have convex costs is this: that allows you to have an interaction between product and process R&D. But it's wrong to say that therefore you should split up the firms into as small, because the returns to our process R&D are scaled by Q.
Right.
So you've got these offsetting effects. In fact, the primary incentive of the firm are to be as big as possible, notwithstanding unless the complexity is too strong, you have this big effect to want to become as big as possible.
So, but that, just let me highlight, what this means is that the firm's incentives are to be as big as possible. Whereas in this stylized model, admittedly stylized, and I don't give up on diversity by any means as yet, but in this model, policymakers want them to be teeny, and firms individually want to be big. So that's an interesting tension here.
And the other thing is, if you look at Wes's slide, there those stars, and the stars tell you which of the results change if you impose constant marginal costs. And everything that Wes told you sort of holds, even if you have constant marginal costs. It's not being driven by the convexity in the cost function. The convexity in the cost function gets you more interesting results, but it's not crucial to.
On the extreme, like concavity of the concavity of returns.
Well, you need something to determine it. Yeah, you're right. So guilty there. I have interior solutions. But other than that, no. So it's not a mechanical exercise.
Right. Good. Sally, I point to the discussion earlier today where we talked about Fairchild getting that contract. That might be interesting. I think in our context, a more targeted federal policy that doesn't just, appeal to the usual suspects, that is the dominant incumbents, but in fact, one that encourages entry in this context, may be pretty interesting. We'd have to think about that more carefully. But I think the bottom line, I think, from your vantage point would be, don't ignore market structure, don't ignore your effects, and if you can actually develop policies that, in fact, have clear implications for that, like encouraging the Fairchilds in the different markets, et cetera, that you're playing around with, that might be interesting. And yes, I think we did a sheesh. So if N falls even further, then all these effects are exacerbated, basically.
I haven't thought about the market structure performance standards. So.
Yeah, the standards question is pretty interesting. I'd have to the stick approach. I'd have to think. I think we both have to think much more carefully. So if you actually subsidize to a standard rather than say, hey, company X, here's some money to do, to work more on solar panels, that might be a way to kind of, I think, crack some of this, because what that does is alter incentives, and that becomes interesting.
Okay. So I think you've addressed the first round of questions. Thanks to everybody's cooperation, we have a bit more time before lunch, so I'd like to open up a second round of questions that can address any paper, right, and any person who's presented. So we can broaden the discussion, and of course you can keep on, torturing Wes and Ashish as long as you like, because that's a great section of sport. Okay, Ken.
Product innovation can be divided into two kinds: the incremental sort that doesn't create new markets but improves products, and in that sense it works like process innovation, and the product innovation that really makes something new. In the cases of the industries I studied a lot with Steven, it became clear that the kind that created new markets was not very common, and the other kind was really common. So
that's right.
It'd be interesting to try to be careful to distinguish these and think about their different impacts and
operationally. Totally, yes, I agree. I mean, clearly it's a matter of degree and it's a continuum, but yes, I basically agree with your point.
Yeah. Russell.
So you brought up two different kinds of shakeout processes, where one is like firms are not innovating as much and sort of falling out, and another is more they're merging and they are innovating. And it reminded me of Rajshri's idea about this shakeout early on, like in the incubation period. Do you see that being applicable?
Well, so first of all, the industries that I studied with Steven were cases where merger and acquisition were very small as a percentage of the total number of exits, and they really didn't play much of a role in driving the shakeout. So we could have that in some cases. I don't know how often that happens. Certainly there are cases someone can point to, but I don't think that's the common pattern in driving this one up. Does that answer your question?
Yep.
Yeah. Any other questions for any presenter? Yes.
I'd just like to make a comment more than a question. That is, a couple of people have mentioned the Fairchild case and the contract, and in some ways that's sort of cherry picking the evidence.
It is.
That is that the government at that point was supporting an enormous range of projects with an enormous range of certainty and uncertainty involved. And so you look back on it and say, well, they picked a winner there. Well, they did. They picked a whole bunch of losers too. Good. And so I think that overall those losers had a contribution to make as well. And so if you look at the picture from a slightly higher aerial view, all of it, 90% of it, I'm just guessing, made a positive contribution, even where there were no products that worked in the long run.
Right. So for the reference on that, you should consult Holbrook et al. Strategic Management Journal. And what, Connie, did you notice that? to go to those, right? But more to the point, so I don't mean to say pick Fairchild. What I'm saying is, pick at least in your portfolio of picks, pick a number of the smaller entities and so on, recognizing though, reflecting your point, that most of those guys will probably be losers. So, but I think it means the main point was pay attention to the number and size distribution of firms and who you're going after. Are you encouraging entry or not? Recognizing full well that Fairchild merged, but a whole bunch of others washed out. Absolutely. Great point.
Cast a lot of bread.
That's right.
On the waters.
But that's what venture capital does, right? So basically, we're advocating the government to take the function of venture capital.
Yeah, but DOT is getting involved in business, so.
Venture capitalists don't want to come near the stuff that we want to invest in.
That's right, and venture capitalists are actually, they will fund much more downstream stuff than probably what the feds are willing to fund.